Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to the second day of the SIEL conference. My name is Yunshuan Li, and I'll be serving as your MC for today. After the panel session this morning, we now proceed to Roundtable Discussion 2, Climate Change and Industrial Policy. Let us welcome the moderator, Professor Peter van den Bossche, and the speakers, Mr. John Chen-Chung Deng, Mr. Kazumochi Kometani, Ms. Viola Lin, Ms. Joanna Redelbach, and Professor Mark Wu. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning to all of you. Over the last 10 days, we had flash floods in Texas, which have claimed 120 lives, and they're still looking for 170 people. We had heat waves and wildfires in Europe, which are estimated to have taken 2,300 lives. We had the cyclone Dana, which in India, just to take one country, made the government evacuate 1.2 million people. And as I understand, it also upset some of your travel schedules. This is the reality that we live with. Over the past decade, or let's say the past decade has been the warmest, the hottest on record. And if we look forward, in the next 5 years, the expectation is that we will have average temperatures above 1.5 Celsius. And you all know that that is sort of the magical limit that we have to stay below. Sea levels continue to rise. And Asia, and I'm mentioning that because we are in Asia, Asia is warming twice as fast as the global average. Now, scientists have been telling us for many years that this is a crisis that we need to resolve, that we need to address. This is an existential crisis. It has been said so often that we don't even internalize this anymore, that it's an existential crisis. Scientists have told us that a significant reduction of global carbon emissions is crucial. And that brings us to industrial policy, which is the topic of this roundtable discussion. Now, in preparing for sharing this discussion, my attention was drawn to an article by Todd Tucker in the last issue of the Journal of International Economic Law. And many of you may be familiar with that. It's the June issue of the journal. An article in which he argues that industrial policy, and for a reason that I'm still trying to understand, he distinguishes industrial policy from carbon pricing, where I think that carbon pricing is part of industrial policy, but we'll hear the panel talk about that. That industrial policy is the most viable politically and substantively instrument to address climate change. Now, many of you may also have seen on the International Economic Law and Policy blog, Simon Lester's reaction to this article. And he starts his comment with that comment that he has his comment under a very provocative title, which I thought I would share with you as a start of this discussion. The title is Industrial Policy Undermining the Fight Against Climate Change? Now, to answer that question, we have a great panel of experts from academia, from government, from industry, and legal practice. I wish I could claim credit for having composed this panel, but I cannot. It's a great panel. And in alphabetical order, we have Minister John Deng sitting next to me. Minister Deng was minister from 2014 to 2016. He was Minister of Economic Affairs, and from 2016 to last year, he was the minister in charge of the Office of Trade Negotiations. Next, we have Kazumochi Kometani, who is a lecturer at the Graduate School of Public Policy of the University of Tokyo, and also of Counsel of one of Japan's leading law firms. Next, we have Viola Lin, who's Interim General Counsel for Taiwan and Head of Legal APAC of Ørsted, Asia Pacific. And then we have Joanna Redelbach, who is counsel at Van Bael and Bellis. And finally, but certainly not least, as they say, Mark Wu, who is professor of law at Harvard Law School and also faculty associate of the Harvard University Center for the Environment. Now, so a great panel and little time. Yeah, the organizers in their wisdom gave us 75 minutes, and I have already taken up too much time. The way in which I thought we would organize this, and this was discussed with the discussants, I have a number of questions, and they will answer, hopefully, those questions. And I'll do this one by one. And I hope that their short answer will actually then trigger others to make comments on the answer. That's the way in which it is set up. And we have a timekeeper there who will warn us when there's only 1 minute in the 12-minute session, 1 minute left in the 12-minute session. Okay. My first question goes to Joanna. Well, to address the climate crisis and reduce greenhouse gases, and I just told you how important scientists think that is, different member states have used different policy measures, policy instruments. The United States, under the Inflation Reduction Act, is focusing very much on subsidies, while the European Union, under CBAM, goes for carbon pricing. Now, I understand, and I'm not a specialist in this field, but I understand that in the EU Green Industrial Plan, also a number of other instruments are mentioned. And I would be interested, what are these other industrial policy instruments? Everybody talks about subsidies, everybody talks about carbon pricing, but there are other instruments. What are these other instruments? And of these instruments, what are the ones that are most likely to make a positive contribution? Joanna.
Well, thank you very much for this kind introduction, and I'm really grateful to be able to participate in this roundtable discussion. I think it is interesting to look at the approach taken by the EU in terms of addressing the climate crisis through industrial policy, because that approach is quite comprehensive and it consists of several different types of measures. Maybe briefly, just as a way of background, the basis for the EU's approach has been laid down in the EU Green Deal Industrial Plan, which was adopted back in 2023, and which has been since then complemented by several additional policy documents, but also specific legislative acts, such as the Net Zero Industry Act or the Critical Raw Materials Act, which many of you might have already heard of. As I've mentioned, this approach consists of a mix of various measures which are aimed at enabling the EU to achieve net zero economy by 2050 while remaining competitive. And this focus on the competitiveness has been particularly strengthened in the recent past. For the purpose of this discussion, I was thinking to focus on 4 elements, or let's say 4 broad categories of measures which are taken by the EU and which are included in that approach. Now, the first element or the first category of measure is, as you have mentioned, carbon pricing, which has been in place in the EU already for a number of years in the form of the EU emissions trading system, or the EU ETS, and this is the internal measure applicable to domestic emissions. This system has been recently extended to also include imports of certain carbon-intensive products via the so-called Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or the CBAM. And the objective of these 2 measures is, in essence, to impose a price on carbon embedded in the relevant products, and by doing that, to incentivize more green production, both in the EU but also in third countries, and also to prevent the so-called carbon leakage and to ensure the level playing field in the EU. Now, in terms of the effectiveness of these measures, it is estimated that by 2023, the ETS has helped to reduce industrial emissions in the EU by approximately 47% in comparison to the 2005 level, which is the moment when the ETS has started to apply. The situation of the CBAM is slightly more complicated, partly because this measure is still in its transitional phase, which means that we do not have any specific figures yet. That being said, some estimates suggest that the impact on the lowering of global emissions of the CBAM may actually be quite limited. I think that the result in practice will very much depend also on actions that will be taken by producers in third countries and the extent to which they will be willing to change their production methods to remain access to the EU market, or whether they will opt for changing their export flows and exports to other markets while not really changing their operations. I think it will also depend on measures that may be taken by other third countries. We now see that certain countries, a number of countries, most notably the UK, are thinking and are working on their own CBAM, so this kind of maybe not coordinated action, but similar measures taken by third countries may put additional pressure on lowering emissions on a global level. But I think in general, we'll need to wait and see what will be the practical impact of the carbon pricing on global level of emissions. Now, the second type of industrial policy measures that are being taken by the EU are regulatory in nature. In the EU industrial deal, the EU has identified a number of net zero industry or net zero technologies which will benefit from accelerated permitting processes and in general simpler and faster administrative procedures. And these technologies include batteries, solar, wind, heat pumps, hydrogen, several others. And in addition to that, the EU has also set certain specific benchmarks in terms of EU industrial capacity by 2030 to incentivize investments in those specific industries and technologies. The regulatory measures also include certain sustainability requirements and product standards, which apply to products that are placed on the EU market, so both products that are manufactured in the EU and imports. And these kind of standards and requirements can be either industry or sector specific, and here I can mention the EU batteries regulation, but they can also be adopted within a broader framework of the EU Eco-Design for Sustainable Products regulation. And this type of measures are aimed to help with the rollout of clean industries, to support demand for this kind of products, but also to incentivize third country producers to comply with the EU standards, and thereby also improving sustainability of products which are manufactured in third countries. The third category of measures are subsidies, which also have been already mentioned also during the previous panel discussion in this room. And here the situation in the EU is slightly different than in the US, and this is partly because subsidies are provided by individual EU member states, and they are also governed by relatively strict stated rules in the EU, which regulate and which limit the type and the amount of support that can be provided. Now, that being said, the EU has recently adopted a new framework providing additional flexibility for green subsidies, very much recognizing that this is a powerful industrial policy tool. And under this new framework, which will in principle be in place at least until 2030, the EU member states are allowed to support investments in new manufacturing projects for net zero technologies, including, interestingly, to prevent such investments from being diverted away from the EU. So in case there's a project which is meant to take place in the EU and then is moved, for example, to the US because of the IRA, although I understand that now it's no longer the case, then the EU member states would be allowed to match subsidies provided abroad in order to keep that project in the EU. And additional financial support is also provided via various EU-wide instruments, such as the Innovation Fund, which actually uses revenues from the EU emissions trading system, so the internal carbon pricing mechanisms. And this kind of funding supports various projects, including recently several projects in different EU member states relating to the manufacturing of EV batteries. So I would say that although these financial measures in the EU are less straightforward than in the US, it is not correct to say that there is no subsidy aspect when it comes to the EU's approach to industrial policy and climate change. Now, I think that what is interesting is that in addition to carbon pricing, regulatory measures, and various types of funding, the EU is also deploying certain defensive measures, so that would be the fourth category, let's say. And here what I mean is the more strategic and more targeted use of trade defense instruments, specifically for sectors which are considered as key for the EU green transition. And here one example is the recent imposition of countervailing measures on the import of Chinese electric vehicles to the EU. But this is something that we see not only in practice, but also explicitly mentioned in various EU policy instruments, including the EU Green Deal Industrial Plan. And these measures are aimed to complement other measures which are provided to the industry to support this setting up and the scaling up of green industries in the EU by protecting these industries from unfair competition, from dumping and subsidies provided in third countries. So it might be that we will see this kind of measures imposed to respond to green subsidies which will be provided in third countries. Now, I said that I will focus on 4 measures, and I know that we have limited time, but just very briefly, just to say that, because I mentioned that the approach in the EU is quite comprehensive, there are also other types of measures, including certain sustainability requirements in public procurement, which I think might be also quite powerful and quite effective. And another element that might be worth mentioning, even though it is not part of industrial policy per se, I think are various trade-related initiatives which are being taken, and that includes negotiation of clean trade and investment partnerships. So that shows that in addition to, let's say, internal measures which are being taken in the EU, there's also this external aspect of cooperation, which I think is quite relevant if we're thinking about addressing climate change, which is a global problem, and lowering emissions, not only in the EU, but also in other countries. So I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. This is great. So it's tax, regulation, subsidies, trade defense, public procurement, and cooperation. Any comments from the other panelists on, is this list complete? Is there perhaps one that was mentioned that we would not consider to be an appropriate measure? I see no takers for that question. Please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. I'd like to, I agree with the importance of the environmental policy, our climate change industry policy, but I have many things to say about the CBAM, but I choose only one of them due to a time constraint. My point is that the CBAM's contribution to the green transition may be indirect. From a domestic policy viewpoint, I think the CBAM's contribution is that it would help the EU Commission persuade the EU industries to accept additional cost burdens under the EU emission trading system by providing certain protection from international competition to such EU industries. In other words, I suspect that if the EU had maintained some import duties to protect such domestic industries, the EU may have had less difficulty in introducing the ETS without free allocation. In this connection, I would like to point out that compared with the import duties, the CBAM has a number of side effects. For example, it effectively forces the EU policy choice on countries exporting their products to the EU, despite the differences in policy priorities and responsibilities for global warming. Further, the CBAM imposes very complicated procedural requirements on exporters, and will be more so when, in particular, by expanding the scope of covered imports to downstream products. Thus, I'm curious about whether the EU has examined as an alternative the possibility of increasing import duties +1, 2, GATT Article 28. Further, this possibility may, even if it may not be with other members' domestic policy, including environmental policy. That's my comment. Thank you.
I'm just going to make one comment. I think Joanna gave us a very comprehensive list. I do think, as an outside observer of what's happening in the EU, there is a tension that's playing out, and I think it's playing out differently in different member states about the economic desire to sort of preserve the economic gains that come about from the clean energy transition, as opposed to simply accelerating the pace of that transition. And I think that's a question put bluntly, right? How much do you simply want to say thank you to the Chinese for putting in place such aggressive green industrial policies that lower the cost and accelerate the speed of that, versus the need to preserve jobs in certain traditional industries that are undergoing that transition? And I think we've seen that story play out in solar and wind in Europe, but I think it's going to be a much greater story once it hits electronics and EVs and so on and so forth. And I think that's a tension that plays out differently across different member states.
Thank you very much, Mark. We'll have to move on to the next question, but allow me to say that I agree with many things that Joanna said, but especially that the jury is still out on CBAM, yeah? And whether CBAM will be do more than make a marginal contribution to the fight against climate change. Moving on, and my question is in the first place to Kazumochi, and it deals with the WTO consistency of climate change-related subsidies. Are they necessarily inconsistent under WTO law? And one thing that I would like you to reflect on is the appellate body's attempt, in the absence of a justification for environmental subsidies in the SEM agreement itself, to make a distinction in the context of the benefit determination, to make a distinction between, on the one hand, in that, I'm referring to the FIT case, FIT renewable energy case, to make a distinction between, on the one hand, green electricity, the market of green electricity, and the market of dirty electricity. Now, some of the economists have told me, Peter, that is nonsense from an economic perspective. You're completely wrong. But it was the way out of a difficult situation. Yeah? Now, is that the way forward, or is the way forward to start applying Article 20 GATT in the context of violations of the subsidies agreement? The United States has been proposing this recently. Is that the way forward? Do we need an SEM-specific justification for environmental subsidies? It's a second possibility. A third possibility is to revive the category of non-actionable subsidies. So what's the way forward? So first, perhaps a comment on the WTO consistency in general, and then how can we introduce in the WTO law context justifications for subsidies, environmental subsidies?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. In fact, I have participated in the case, Canadian FIT case, as a representative of Japanese mission, and I was surprised to see the end results. From my personal, and my first answer is to your question. I think the climate change related subsidies should be normally consistent with the WTO law, including the SEM agreement. Normally means that I have doubt on the WTO consistency of the local content requirements contained in such subsidy program like the IRA of the United States and of the PPM element like CBAM. But I would like to add another concern in the list, that leaving such subsidies unrestricted under the subsidy agreement would likely give rise to the overcapacity problem. I think the overcapacity is prevailing on the environmental products, for example, electric vehicles and solar panels. And although I should say that the overcapacity problem is observed not only in relation to environmental products, but also in semiconductor or steel or other kind of things. But in this light, I'd like to take issue with the appellate body ruling on the Canadian FIT program the chair referred to, because, and on that case, exactly because domestic consumers were not willing, yet prepared to pay premium to renewable energy, and thus the government of Ontario chose the FIT program rather than leaving it to the consumer's choice. Therefore, I agree with the economists' criticism in that regard. And a negative consequence of this case is that by distinguishing the two markets, renewable and non-renewable energy markets categorically, the appellate body effectively excluded preferential financial support for the more renewable energy or more friendly, environmental friendly products or models from the the scope of subsidy agreement, including Part 3 on the actionable subsidies. I think there is a number of possibilities in the SM agreement to explore, and that may solve or mitigate the overcapacity problem caused by the industrial policy subsidies. So my view is and I think they say that the appellate body must have concern that no distinction had been made between the two markets, and then the FIT program may be found in consistent WTO agreement. As Chair said, there is no except green subsidy exception. But I do believe that the appellate body could have found a better way out. And in this regard, I think the Article 20 is may not be enough to justify the climate change related subsidies, because my understanding is the contemporary economic theory explains that such subsidies, including the FIT program, does not directly aim at environmental protection, and rather aim at internalizing positive externalities, for example, the merit of scale within the industry-wide merit of scale, and consequently establishing a competitive domestic industry, the program aimed at ultimately establishing a competitive domestic industry producing more environmentally friendly products. It is also the case with the research and development subsidy. So it's not easy to find such industry policy objectives in the list of Article 20. And the introduction of special exception clause and the revival of the non-actionable subsidy clause needs obviously amendment to the SEM agreement, but I think it is probably impracticable to seek that members' agreement on within the current WTO climate. But I do believe that there must be a way out in the current text of the WTO agreement. As I stated at the outset, climate change-related subsidies should be normally consistent with the WTO agreement. This is because such subsidies help each member ensure the proper functioning of its market mechanism, domestic market mechanism, by internalizing positive externality, and thus consistent with the preamble of the WTO agreement, which refers to the optimal use of world resources. Therefore, I believe that existing SME agreement can and should be interpreted to allow such subsidies. My proposal, among others, is to make reference to the text of Article 6.3 of the subsidy agreement, which indicates that serious prejudice in the sense of paragraph C of Article 5 may arise in any case where one or several of the following apply. I should read the term may to imply the need to consider what is the policy objective of subsidy and how appropriately the subsidy program is designed to achieve that objective. That consideration is needed in the serious prejudice examination. Maybe whether it aims at correcting a certain market failure and accordingly designed properly could be a standard for the examination. And take a step further. A subsidy measure should be found inconsistent unless it aims at any legitimate policy objective and appropriately tailored to achieve that objective, however small its trade effect is. Such WTO inconsistent subsidy measure would be so market distortive as to make the use of world resource suboptimal. I think in this line, the WTO agreement should be should and could be interpreted to apply to allow the green subsidies. That's my comment.
Thank you very much for this. And you have added one other way out, one other way to justify or allow for a finding of non-inconsistency of environmental subsidies by focusing on the serious prejudice determination. I hadn't thought of that before, but that's... Now, members of the panel, any further comments on ways out or disagreement with one of the ways I mentioned or the additional way that was mentioned by Kazumochi? Who takes the floor first? Minister Deng.
Thank you very much for Kometani-san. Very, very helpful suggestion. My question is for a country who wants to start a environmental friendly electricity capability. Any other economic tools or financial attraction that the nation can design to attract more investment on that sector besides FITs. Now, there are so many discussions on FITs, and and then FITs, later on, I think Ms. Lin can tell us more about in Taiwan's experiences. But in Taiwan's case, we need to have much bigger portion of electricity produced by recycled, climate-friendly method. However, no matter how much efforts we put on that, the goal always lag behind. The actual performance always lag behind the goals we established. So my question to you is a little bit outside of our discussion. Besides FITs, any other economic attraction that you think that is SCM consistent, that a nation can adopt? Thank you.
Yes, please, for a short reply.
Yeah. I think the industry policy needs to be established so that the final result is to be the the industry should be viable. From that viewpoint, I think the aim of our policy of rationale underlying this industry policy needs to be needs to correct the market failure in a sense. To find a market failure that is that I think that we can find anywhere in the market. So I think to the extent the government finds certain market failures, in particular the dynamic scale of merit of scale or something like that, that you can subsidize the industry, and that industry policy should be allowed under the SCM agreement, because it ultimately serves the optimization of domestic policy and ultimately the world economy. That's my view.
I think on this note, we're ready to move to the third set of questions, which are directed to the industry. My question is for Viola. The offshore wind industry, with which you're very, very familiar, is probably is an excellent case study for the relevance of industrial policy measures in the creation and then the further development of climate change-related industries in general. Now, I have two questions for you. First, I know that you're also familiar with the European offshore wind industry. But if you look at both industries, the European and the Taiwanese, what kind of industrial policy, instruments have contributed most to the creation of a vibrant wind industry in either of the regions? And what lessons can Taiwan learn from Europe, and what lessons can Europe learn from Taiwan? Please.
Thank you. So first of all, it's a huge honor and pleasure to be able to be on this distinguished panel. I have a disclaimer first. Like I know very little about international economic law. So I have a Chinese saying describing what I'm doing now is 班门弄斧. That I'm showing my martial arts in front of world champions or kung fu masters. So bear with me on that. But back to Professor's question. Indeed, I think offshore wind industry is an excellent example to show how you can utilize industrial policy to kickstart and further develop a new technology, and that contributes to action that counter climate change. So the key industrial policy has been used for offshore wind will be mainly surrounding two areas. One will be creating demand. The second will be bringing route to markets. But before I deep dive into those two areas, I think for the benefit of audience who are not very familiar with offshore wind, I can bring in maybe some special characteristic of offshore wind industry to set the scene, which will be also relevant to my answer. So two things. First of all, offshore wind is capital intensive. So similar to many other infrastructure projects, offshore wind required huge investment upfront. So let's take a most recent example in Taiwan, a 500 megawatt offshore wind project, which recently achieved a financial close, will require investment amount about $5 billion USD. And the majority of the fund will be spent at the construction. So if you imagine the profile of spending, if you want to build an offshore wind project, the development journey will be long. So that also linked to my second point that offshore wind is a long cycle industry. So it usually takes 5 to 8 years to develop a project until you can bring the project to construction. And then when you construct, that is when the most of the funding will be used because you spend all the capex on purchasing turbines and mobilizing vessels. However, your revenue only comes from when the wind farm is built, right? It's a long, steady revenue for the wind farm to sell the electricity generated for the next 20 to 35 years. So that's the very special characters of offshore industry. And most of the offshore wind project, because of the scale of investment, is counting on asset level project financing, which means the loan you borrowed will mainly be repaid by the revenue it generates, and it will not be backed by the sponsor's balance sheet. So that is kind of the background setting for offshore industry. So back to the questions, what will be relevant? I think the first main area will be demand. So by demand, I refer to a clear, committed, renewable target set by the government. So including that target could include offshore wind build-out targets. It will include strong political support, and then a clear route to markets, a clear framework that allows offshore wind to happen. That is fundamental to the industry. And on the opposite side, an opposite example, you can see the example of US. What happened recently in the US is that after President Trump took his office, then he released one executive order to temporarily withdraw all the offshore seabed lease for all the projects. On top of that, he issued a stop of work order on a project that is in construction. So that is the opposite example. You can see how the political uncertainty can bring to affect a project. So on the demand side, for Taiwan, I think a good example is that the demand can also come from private sectors. So Taiwan has a very strong demand of renewable power from our semiconductor industry. And that is mainly driven by the demand of a global supply chain. They want to see net zeros down in the waterfall of the supply chain. You also see that many of the Taiwanese enterprise, they have committed to ambitious net zero targets like RE100 or their ESG targets. So demand can be also private sector driven. So that is first on the demand side. And the second, and for that, why demand is important for the industry? Because once you have a long-term market outlook, it will become the key drivers for economic of scaling. And then it will incentivize investment into new technology. It will continue to accelerate and mature supply chain. A well-sequenced pipeline will also boost the confidence of financiers and investors. So that's why demand matters. And the second relevant policy will be around the route to markets. What I mean by route to market, it's the revenue certainty. The long-term stable, long-term revenue certainty is also key, or the foundation for an offshore wind project. So as I mentioned, this is important based on what I described, the offshore wind's nature, that you only get money or by completing the offshore wind farm, and that has to be long-term because you wouldn't be able to get back all your investment in day one or year one. It probably be year 10 after the offshore wind farm is in operation. So if we look in the development journey of past 30 or 35 years, in Europe and in Taiwan, I think many of the industrial policy tool has been used. So in the beginning, like in the very first beginning, you could see a direct grant or the concession payments, or like in Taiwan, the first 2 turbines are basically the government will sponsor the funding, the capex of that turbine. And what you see in Australia recently on the state of Victoria, they are considering having this availability payment based on the capacity of the wind farm top up with a contract for difference regime. So you do see that policy tool still being used, but mostly in the initial phase of the industry. And then you start to see feed-in tariff. I think everyone's very familiar, it goes without saying. But other than that, you also see feed-in premium. That is, so feed-in tariff, a bit different than feed-in tariff. Feed-in premium is that you have a market. So the government give you a premium on top of what you get from the electricity market. And there are many diverse way of how different countries utilize or design their feed-in premium. So I wouldn't dive into detail for that. But contract for difference is also a very important tool that is used in UK, for instance, and now in Australia, and will be used more often. And also, maybe I should give a little bit explanation of what contract of difference means. So contract of difference is that the government and the generator will agree on a strike price. And once after the wind farm starts selling power to the market, if the market price is lower than the strike price, then the government or the designated counterparty will make up that shortfall. But if the market price is higher than the strike price in a two-way CFD regime, then the generator need to pay back the surplus to the government. So we believe that that is actually quite a balance. If it's a two-way CFD, it is quite a balanced risk and revenue sharing mechanism between the private company, private sector, and the government. Of course, you also see one-way CFD where if you have upside, you don't need to pay back. But now we have the belief that the two-way CFD is a good way. And then you also see tax credits, like the IRA in the US. So there are a different kind of tools. And then it could also be a mix and combination of both. So, so these policies allows developers or allow the private sector to able to get finance, because your lenders, your investor will look at you and see, what are you going to make money? And will that be a stable, long-term revenue? And that will also make developer or the industry and our supply chain to have that certainty and confidence to make investment. So as to your question, Professor, about this, what is the most industrial policy that may be most vibrant? I think the honest answer is there is no one-size-fits-all answer to it, because it really varies among different markets, the market situation. Like in Taiwan, we don't have a liberalized electricity market now. So it's very different. But if I still have time, I don't know how much. Okay, I think I should speed up. On that, so I guess it's just a note that Ørsted has made a position paper in this April. It's online, so you can search. We just make a lobby or statements to the EU countries with 2 points, also echoing the demand and also the revenue. So we are suggesting that the EU countries should take a coordinated action and commitment to commit for 10 times 10, which means release 10 gigawatt pipeline for the next 10 years from 2031 to 2040, and it has to be consistent and stable. So it's not like up and down, so the industry had no predictability. And for the revenue side, we propose this two-way CFD. We think that's a good balance. And then if I still may have some time, what are the lessons learned? Yeah. So I will skip, I was originally thinking about sharing this journey of offshore wind, but I guess I don't have that time, so I'll go straight to the lesson learned. So on the lesson learned part, I have 4. So the first one is long-term policy consistency with clear targets and timeline is fundamental. I think based on what I just said, it should be quite clear that you need to have that consistent, stable outlook. Let the whole industry, not only on the developer side, but also lenders and investors, to believe there is a clear demand for offshore wind, for renewable. And second is efficient and coordinated process and close collaboration between public and private is the key enablers. So offshore wind project is a very complex process and is a highly regulated industry. And that means hundreds of permits will need to be acquired when you start to develop and build an offshore wind farm. So you cannot do it without this close collaboration, public-private partnership. And the third one is the government set the framework, but it is the industry who bring it to life. So I think the government provide this vision, and then the industry will bring in a lot. So we also contribute. It's not that the government need to do all the things and all the homework for the industry, but the industry will bring in global experience, innovations, and investments. And eventually I refer to we as a community as a whole will benefit from the maturation of the industry. Because at the end of the day, we hope, our goal is to get, we see the faster and renewable build out, we get more clean energy, and then we have affordable price. I think the focus on price is high now. And then eventually we can drive long-term value for our people, for our planet, for our community. And the last thing, since we're having conference here, so I really need to brag about Taiwan. So Taiwan's offshore industry is indeed an amazing, a very strong example how adaptive industrial policy can be. So in just over a decade, for the past 10 years, Taiwan has built more than 421 turbines, which is standing at Taiwan Strait now, generating more, I think the capacity is more than 3 gigawatt. That makes Taiwan rank as number 5 countries in the world in terms of offshore wind build out. So that tells a lot itself. And then the ability, I think the open-mindedness of the government is something that we really appreciated. The ability to listen, to learn and adapt and refine policy on a continuous basis is the key core strengths of Taiwan, that we are ready for the challenges for the next phase. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Viola. And I hope that the policymakers among you have been listening very carefully to what the industry needs. Yeah? I'm not going to go through the list again, but this was enlightening. Minister Deng, you're next. And for you, I have the question, perhaps to start with a somewhat provocative question. how important has the objective of addressing climate change really been in Taiwan's industrial policy? Because an industrial policy obviously pursues multiple objectives. How important has climate change been? Within that industrial policy, what were the primary measures that were taken to address climate change? And then perhaps as a last one, and it's similar to the question that I already asked to Viola, but in a more broader sense, what can Taiwan still learn from the rest of the world, and what can the rest of the world learn from Taiwan in this particular respect?
Thank you very much, Peter. I want to thank Viola for speaking most of the issues I want to address. And she's from private sectors. And when I worked for government, what we often heard is we haven't done enough to help the industry. So I'm very happy to hear that first time that we are doing something, we've been doing something right. As a retired minister, now at least I feel my load on my shoulder is much lighter. As to how important the government policy put on the climate change reduction of the emission. I have to admit that when this climate thing started in probably in 1990, about 30 years ago, everyone was debating and puzzling what will happen for the future and how much we have to invest on that on this issue. And now it is very, very clear that this 2050 goal is written into law and announced by two presidents. One of our keynote speaker, she announced that, and later now the current sitting president also announced that. So it is very clear this is the national goal. All the policies has to fit into that goal. So that make different agencies, there are many agencies responsible for that, make the job much easier for those ministries. Ministry of Environmental Protection, Ministry of Economic Affairs, the Financial Supervisory Commission, so on and so forth, education, make the concerted efforts much easier. As to what kind of measures we take, pretty much discussed today. It's financial help, called subsidy. Financial help to help the industries to replace their equipment, to install new equipments, to do research. I mean, we need more research on how to store the electricity we generated. This is very important. In the bad days, there's no wind. In these rainy days, there's no solar powers. But in some other situation, you have extra electricity generated. So storage is one thing. And on the technology side, government helps. We give tax break for those companies who invest in the technology of less emission equipments. Now, what we can learn from the international partners, I think there are many things we can learn. we will start our carbon fee next year. We have to learn from those countries who already have this system for some years. We already have this carbon exchange system, but not really functioning. So we have to learn from those countries. We have to learn, although we already have quite good legal framework to help this goal, but again, on the governance, on the legal system, we have to learn from our trading partners. Technology is the most important thing we have to learn. We have to work with our partners. For that, sometimes we often have this grievance of being kept away from some international organizations. We need your help. This all interconnected, and we have good stories to tell. We have good experience to share. The good stories to share is, in past 15 years, our economic growth is pretty much maintained in between 2 to 3%. So in 15 years, that's a goal. That's a performance that we think compared to others, it is quite can be bragging for that. But the emission level maintains pretty much stable. So that represents a country who can maintain relatively good economic performance, but also can maintain the stability of the emission. We have the record, and we can share that with other countries. Now, the difference on this climate change approach, basically, I think I can categorize as two approaches. One is producing countries, for those who export, for those who produce, and the consumers countries who import, who consume. So I think if I say that, that's relatively easy to identify. US, Europe, they are the consumer countries. So you have various systems to reduce the emission. But for the producing countries who need to balance their economic growth and their emission obligations, Taiwan is in between. Taiwan is producing as well as a consuming country. However, for instance, China, it says in 2030, we will reach the peak, and then we start to reduce. But in our case, we start to do it now. So we do not have that concern of the producing countries. With this as a very clear national goal, I think the real engine for Taiwan to continue to move on this climate change is our business awareness. They now, all the business, you talk to them, you say, what is the most important concern to you, and what kind of efforts you were to make in the future? Climate change. I have no doubt, talk to whoever, to those people that you recognize who work on the business, that will be the answer, climate change. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I have bad news for you. We still want to hear from Mark, obviously, and I also want to give you the opportunity to ask questions. So the bad news is that we will eat into the lunch period. Not going to put this for a vote. This is just, Mark, I have the following question for you, and I suppose over the last 6 months you've often been confronted with what the Trump 2 administration is doing. But let me ask you the following question. So we had the Inflation Reduction Act from the Biden administration, to which I already referred to in my introduction, which offers, inter alia, billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars of tax incentives to renewable energy industries. It has, however, been reported that the Trump 2 administration has been gutting that program. So is this indeed the case? And if it is the case, is the Trump administration proposing another industrial policy to address climate change, or are they just going to ignore the existence of climate change and they will not have any industrial policy or any policy? And is that going to inspire perhaps other countries to follow the United States example?
Great, thank you, Peter. I think Viola talked about policy consistency when it comes to climate change and industrial policy. I come from a country where this is a hotly contested political issue. Both parts of that and equation, right? There are people who think climate change is happening, and there are people who do not. There are people who believe in industrial policy, and there are people who do not. And so I alluded to earlier, right? There are other countries, particularly authoritarian ones, right, where this policy consistency can be applied and can be almost put on a accelerated pace, leading to the overcapacity issue that Kometani-san referred to. So I think this is something, as we look at this as particularly academics, right, we realize, right, there's a political economy equation here when it comes to this roundtable topic that's very much at stake here. Now, Peter, to your specific question, I think we have to sort of disaggregate it a bit in terms of thinking about this administration. And we also have to think about it not just this administration, but also this particular Congress, because, of course, industrial policy in the United States is not made just by the executive branch. It can do so through one of the policy measures that Joanna referred to, right, which would be for regulatory measures. But when it comes to subsidies in particular, and that's what was emphasized in the prior administration, right, this is also something which has to work its way through the legislative branch. And so here, I want to say, I think you certainly have people who fall into the climate change skeptic element. So to answer your question, right, they would not be seeking to replace this with anything because they don't think, you don't put in industrial policy for what you don't believe to be a problem, right? There are others, right, who are viewing this through a national security lens. And so if you're looking at it from a national security lens, what you hear these individuals arguing is that the resource energy endowment of the United States is very different than many other countries. And so it requires a different type of security policy. In particular, the United States is more similar to countries like Russia, Canada, Gulf states, and so forth, which are blessed with certain traditional energy resources. And to shift away production from those resources has certain national security costs, which is very different than countries that aren't blessed with such resources. Think, for example, many of the countries here in East Asia, but also much of the European Union, not all, right? Much of South Asia and so forth, right? And for those countries, a shift towards a clean energy base actually is security enhancing. And so those individuals think, right, that the prior administration took the wrong approach towards its overall industrial policy for security purposes. But that's not from a climate change lens, right? That's from looking at it in terms of the industrial policy and security lens. And then I think there's a third group or a third camp, which would be folks who would argue, right, even if you think climate change is happening and you believe in industrial policy, as was referred to by several of the panelists in the session I moderated previously, right? Industrial policy needs to be designed to fit the particular context for that particular industry, given your resource endowments, not just energy, but also human capital, technology, and so forth. And so those individuals look at the current situation and would say, right, you have a market failure, which this panelist also alluded to, but you have different actors reacting to this market failure, introducing an additional set of market distortions, and particularly the overcapacity issue, right, being that large market distortion that's arising. And so they would argue that the prior administration, the Biden administration's policies, right, are not adequate to be able to respond, right, to both the market failure and the market distortions. In other words, right, as some people in the last panel referred to, right, the industrial policy doesn't fit the policy objective. And here, what they would look at is to say, well, I think what would be needed is something much, much larger in scale, both in terms of subsidies, but also in terms of the trade defenses. And there's perhaps not the political will at present to work through the two branches to be able to put that in place. And so I think all of that seems to suggest that, you know, we are moving towards a different place in the United States when it comes to industrial policy and climate change than what was the case 6 months ago, or what would have been the case if we had a different election outcome in November. And yes, certainly, I think many of the people who at the last SIEL conference took issue with the U.S. industrial policy, and particularly the electric vehicle incentives that were tied to production in the U.S. or with FTA partners, right? You may be quite happy with the direction in which this is moving. But if your concern is largely on the climate change side and having the world's largest market, right, apply industrial policy to accelerate the energy transition, then the combination of both the reduction of the subsidies and credits and the continuation of the protectionist policies through the trade defense instruments, right, suggests that that transition will be slowing down. And if you agree with the national security folks, right, that that's not the right approach for the United States to be taking, and security should be play the prime role here, right, then that suggests that you would favor what's happening. So just giving you a sense of the complexity at work here in the United States, but I think that complexity is at work with many, many other countries. And so I hope that gives you a taste of that. One last thing I just want to note is that I think one common misconception is that what was just passed recently, this One Big Beautiful Bill Act, right, or OBBA, is a repeal of the IRA. And I just want to highlight for this audience here, I haven't gone through the hundreds of pages here. Leave it to one professor to give homework to another professor. I haven't gone through all of that, but I just want to point out it's not an outright repeal, right? There are certain types of credits, tax credits, which are either eliminated or phased out, right? That includes the electric vehicle tax credit, but it also includes the hydrogen production tax credit, the clean electricity investment tax credit, the clean electricity production credit. There are others for which the tax credit is tightened, and that's tightened with regards to what are referred to as the foreign entities of concern or the prohibited foreign entities. So if you have certain parts in the supply chain which are tied to strategic competitors, particularly China, Russia, and so forth, right, you're no longer eligible for those credits. And so the OBBA expands that set and tightens the ability to qualify for those credits, including through the phase out. But I want to highlight it also does preserve or even extend certain things that were in the IRA. One of those would be the clean fuel production credit, right? It continues. Another is the ability to sell your energy tax credits. So those continue. And it does accelerate, you know, if you think about the supply chain here for climate change and clean energy, it does accelerate a set of supply-side measures, particularly tied to critical minerals, and making sure that more resources are available for building out stockpiles and for qualifying for deductibility and so forth. So it has had very mixed support from the U.S. business community, but there are some in the U.S. business community, including those tied to clean energy, which do favor what's happening here. It just depends on where you sit on the supply chain. So I hope that gives you a sense of the political economy complexities in my country. But yes, we certainly, to answer your question, we certainly are in a very different position than we were 6 months ago.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for pointing out the complexity of U.S. politics on this and on many other issues. What I was very happy to hear is that there is now at least one area of Trump 2 policy that may become more WTO consistent, where you will have more WTO consistency than you had under the Biden administration. We have, I think, about 10 minutes, and now I see the organizers looking angry at me. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Who breaks the ice? The gentleman up there.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, it's a very insightful panel. I think I have a question for Mark. So what would you advise developing countries that have to battle between improving their industrial ecosystem and as well as recognizing climate change needs and demands? Because again, for us to meet, or for developing countries to meet this climate change demand, there's the need for capital, which is lacking within the space, and the necessity for their industrial policies to sort of favor industries to come and sort of lead to a race to the bottom kind of scenario. So what sort of advice would you give in terms of how to balance between their industrial policy, having the necessary capital for a transition or transitional market? Thank you.
Perhaps we'll collect 3-4 questions, and then we'll ask the panel to respond. The lady over there.
Hi, thank you for the discussion. I'm Sue. I'm a PhD candidate at University College London. I have a question, perhaps posed to the entire panel. I was wondering if you may share some thoughts that I think Mr. Kometani mentioned in his discussion about domestic content requirements that we often see attached to renewable energy subsidies. So the argument effectively goes that even if they are not economically efficient, they're politically necessary. So you either have a legislation that gives out funding to with domestic content requirements, or you have no government funding for green subsidies at all. So I was wondering if you could share some further insights on this, perhaps on top of the perspective of WTO or SEM consistency. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? Okay. Lothar, and then the lady up, and Ilaria. Okay.
Does anybody on the panel believe that local content distortions should be allowed if they are necessary, can't ever be necessary for protecting the environment better, but they can be necessary for getting laws passed through legislators? And for that purpose, does Article 20, in your view, apply to obligations in the SEM agreement?
Thank you, Lothar. Ilaria?
Yes, thank you so much for this very interesting discussion. I just wanted to perhaps build on the discussion that was particularly concerning the subsidies element, just to say that we have launched a study group initiative on reforming subsidies and industrial policy disciplines for a sustainable future. And we are really trying to build up our minds on many of the issues that we've been covering in this panel, including potential way outs for interpretative ad hoc solutions. But we've also discussed considering the very, very low appetite for amendment of the SCM agreement, potential for plurilateral agreements. And I was just wondering what the panel thinks of this potential option and whether there's any room for that and whether this should just cover subsidies, climate change, or whether it should look at more broader level the playing field issues, including, for instance, issues of SOEs, et cetera, and other levels of state intervention. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Back to the panel. Who wants to go first on any of the 4 questions, or all of the 4 questions? Yes, Joanna.
I think I will address all the questions together, if that's okay. I think they relate to, but very briefly, because they all relate to subsidies essentially and the local content requirement. I think the first question was whether domestic content requirement is a necessary element of green subsidies. I think we see from the practice that often local content element is present. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily that it's necessary. I see the comment on the need to convince people that this kind of subsidies are necessary, and including local content, so supporting domestic industries is of course something that helps with acceptance of this kind of programs. We had recently 2 WTO cases relating to subsidies actually for offshore wind, and it was 2 cases initiated by the EU, one against the UK and one against Taiwan actually, and both of these cases related to local content. So we see that indeed this kind of measures which are clearly WTO inconsistent, which violate a SCM agreement, are being included, are being challenged. But in both cases, there was a mutually agreed solution that was found, and I understand that it related to changing that local content requirement, while the measures, the support for offshore wind remain in place. So I would say that it is possible to envisage effective green subsidies without that local content requirement, because it will be in practice inconsistent with the WTO obligations, even if domestically it may be something that would help with passing this kind of laws. I think on the question from Ilaria, I have not read the paper. I'm curious, so I will certainly read it. I think it's also something that was addressed during the previous session in terms of what can be done. Can there be an amendment to the SCM agreement, or can the interpretation be different? I think it's a very difficult question. I will not go into that. I think in an ideal world, we would have an additional agreement, a sort of understanding relating to green subsidies. I don't know how feasible it is, and I don't want to be overly pessimistic. So I would prefer to say yes, that is something that I would definitely like to see. I'm not sure if this is something that will actually happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna.
Maybe if I
Mark.
could go next and address the question that was asked of me from the first gentleman about what the path forward is for developing countries in light of the various green industrial policies. And I'll touch on some of the other questions that were raised. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer. So it really, as I suggested, it really depends on the political economy of your country. It also depends on what the impact of climate change will be on various industries within your country and what the time frame that will be in which that will play itself out. But I do think what's underlying your question is absolutely this notion, and I should point out, 10 years ago, I wrote an article about green industrial policy and how the nature of industrial policy was shifting away. And I think we've seen that in the last 10 years, particularly given China's application of industrial policy, but also the number of different multifaceted elements they put in place here, followed by then the race from the US, EU, and others, to follow on this. It does make it very difficult for any developing country to think about, given not just the market failure, but the market distortions, how can you attract the capital necessary in which to do that? And so I think it's a really legitimate question. It depends on whether or not your resource endowments, particularly if you have critical minerals and so forth, might be able to attract private capital come in, or whether this is really going to have to be the case of working with different foreign governments through either multilateral banks or through the critical partnerships that Joanna alluded to, right, in order to attract the type of foreign capital that comes in. But I think absent that, it's very, very difficult to gain the foothold in that type of industrial policy supply chain. But whether or not one seeks to do so versus, as I alluded to earlier, right, simply think one large global manufacturer for providing cheap sources and adapting those, right, really depends on, what the impact of climate change is going to be in your environment. The domestic content questions and the Article 20 questions in the SCM agreement, I really think domestic content does depend on two things. One is your political economy, in particular, whether or not this works its way through the legislature as it does in the United States, and how much the party in power has control over that legislature versus there's a choke point, right? As you saw in the United States, there was one key senator, right, whose vote was absolutely critical for that. And so, that affects, right, whether or not you have those. But I think it also depends on technology transfer, because you can think about, right, you look at Chinese industrial policy and domestic content that was tied to some elements of that. That was tied to technology transfer, particularly for wind and solar and so forth. So I think it depends on that. And the last thing I'll just say, I mean, we've seen other agreements where there's been explicit incorporation of the general exceptions in another agreement. And so certainly the negotiators knew how to do that. And I'll just point out, right, they chose not to do so for the ASCM. So for jurists to then read that in, I think would run contrary to at least what I would think would be the right approach to be taking with regard to international agreements, right? It should be left up to the political negotiating bodies, the sovereigns themselves, to make those types of decisions. And it's the fact that that's stuck in the gears right now that we've been discussing over the last day and a half.
Okay, other final words. Please, Viola.
I can also take the local content questions, but on a personal view, because otherwise it will be a bit dangerous for me to take it on my company's behalf. So first of all, you see where local content requirements coming from. So to build an industry, for let's take offshoring as an example. If you can build offshoring industry in Taiwan, also benefit from the manufacturer side to build a supply chain. It's a very tempting offer. Like, why government wouldn't take it, wouldn't consider it? It's the additional benefits they can get. And on top of that, I think what we see in recent years is the energy resilience and the independent side. You want to have a resilient supply chain locally, and that is also due to after the Ukrainian war, the weaponize of how they utilize the natural gas as a weapon, and then further rock the EU market, etc. So I think it makes good sense. You want to explore that end. However, and also it's the beauty of industrial policies that you have different goals, and sometimes you can kill multiple birds with one stone. Like you do build an offshore industry, you met your net zero targets, at the same time you build a good manufacturing base, and you increase your energy resilience, etc., and you create quality jobs. So that's all good. But I think one thing we should be aware of is that sometimes you cannot achieve all these targets simultaneously in one go. So take offshoring as an example. On one hand, you want to have speedy build-out to meet your ambitious target. You want to have affordable energy price, because that also related to how competitive our semiconductor industry can be. But on the other hand, if you want to build a supply chain from scratch, it takes time. It also takes money. And the cost will eventually be cascaded down to the whole entire ecosystem. So sometimes it's conflicting in a way. So I guess the thing we are sorting out now is that what is the top priority in this, our local content policy, that what you want to achieve. If you want a speedy build out of offshore wind, and on top of that, you want the price to be competitive, then you may to be a little bit easy to give the supply chain a time for it to mature. Also bring in the market force competition into that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm watching the clock, and I know that the last two panelists would have much to say, but please, briefly.
Yeah, basically, I agree with the views of colleague on the local content requirement.
That's a good start. You agree?
And I think practically the availability of part or component is depend on the viability of the local industry. So I think it depends. As Viola said, I think the ultimate goal, it depends on the how to compromise the conflicting interest or policy objectives. But I think I do believe that if all countries want to dominate the whole market or whole industry, then that would lead to the overcapacity automatically. So I think the international coordination is necessary too, so that the supply chain is diversified sufficiently across the globe. I think that the subsidy agreement may give us certain incentive for members to consider how to achieve. Thank you. How to achieve that goal. I think that from that viewpoint, I think that's we need to explore the possibilities of subsidy agreements more. That's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister Deng, the last word is for you.
5 seconds. I think to have an industrial policy to help your local industries while building up the offshore thing, which Taiwan did. I supported it when I was in government, but must be realistic, must be WTO consistent. Thank you.
Thank you, and allow me to ask you to join me in thanking this excellent panel.
Very good. Thank you, Peter.